Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. So, what do I feed my fish? Well, my regular viewers will know that this 28-year-old naturally balanced aquarium isn't actually fertilised in any way. So, all the nutrients my plants receive are actually just derived from the fish food that I add. And as someone kindly pointed out in the comments recently, that makes what and how I feed my fish actually rather important in the grand scheme of things. So today I thought I'd sort of tell you my sort of philosophy and what I've basically done over the years in terms of how I feed my fish and how I choose to do things. Anyway, as with most things that I do, I tend to try and keep things as simple as possible, particularly in the mornings because the morning is always a busy time of the day and I don't want to be fiddling around with lots and lots of different foods and things. But basically, a little while after the lights come on, which with this tank is sort of round about 10:30, the lights come on about 10, so I give my fish half an hour to sort of wake up before I feed them. Well, the first feed of the day is the simplest, as I say. I literally just use a little bit of crushed up flake or some very fine granular food, which is literally just bite size for the fish. One thing I'd always say about flake food is the very huge sort of flakes that you sometimes get are actually not very useful because they tend to very easily go to waste. They're just too big for your fish. So always I would recommend crushing the flake down so it's bite size for basically whatever size fish that you actually have. And with my fish, that's really quite small in terms of what I break it down to. As far as the amount of food that I feed them, I feed my fish really quite generously, but it's really only as much as they'll eat within a few minutes. You know, it's a reasonable amount, but in the grand scheme of things, it really isn't very much in terms of actual volume, as it were. And I always make a point of sitting and actually observing my fish when I'm feeding them. My basic sort of principle, if you like, is that no food should really hit the bottom. And I think if too much food hits the bottom, then that's basically way too much. So what I normally do is just put in 2 or 3, or maybe 3 or 4 very tiny amounts, maybe just a minute apart, just something along that sort of line. But certainly for the kind of fish that I have, which are basically mid-water fish, this works absolutely fine. And I do obviously have lots of shrimps and snails and other critters on the bottom for the few bits that do reach the bottom, but I always try and keep that to a minimum because I would always say that's too much food really at that kind of point. And then sometimes sort of in the mid-afternoon, if I'm around or if I'm in that particular day, I'll actually give the fish either some frozen Daphnia or frozen sort of Cyclops. Cyclops is a real kind of favourite food of mine and has been for a very long while. Partly because it's one of those foods that makes up a really big percentage of so many fish's sort of natural diets. And although it's very tiny, it's the sort of thing that fish will pick at sort of all day long as they're sort of available. And it's surprising, you would think that being such a small food that only the very small fish like I have would actually eat it, but actually surprisingly big fish will really peck and pick up all the tiny little bits, as it were. So it's one of those foods that I would definitely recommend. And yet for some reason it's one of those foods that's kind of a little bit sort of overlooked or poorly known in the hobby, and it's certainly underutilised anyway, I would say. And unlike so many foods, it's almost impossible to overfeed. You'd have to put an insane amount of Cyclops in to actually overfeed your fish. I think in terms of what it is in terms of nutritionally for your fish, I often think of it a little bit like kind of roughage. It's kind of food that keeps their system healthy and active rather than in itself being sort of super nutritious or anything like that. And it actually reminds me of an experiment that I did many, many years ago when I used to breed lots and lots of fish. I had a batch of red-eye red swordtails, beautiful, great big things they were. And they were all in the same sort of centrally filtered water, but what I did was I split a batch of babies actually into 3 separate tanks. And I fed one tank just on flake food, one tank just on Cyclops, and the last tank on a mixture of Cyclops and flake food. And I did it quite carefully, and I actually weighed the food out. So the weight that the fish had sort of on each meal was basically the same in every tank. What I found really interesting was the tank that received the flake and the Cyclops grew literally 2 or 3 times faster than either of the other 2. And whilst I'm sure this experiment wouldn't exactly stand up to peer review, it's certainly an interesting result nonetheless. And ever since then, I've always been kind of hooked on using Cyclops, and I've always found the fish do really, really well on it. And I'm sure it helps to bring out the colour in them as well, being kind of a little sort of copepod, as it were. Again, I'd feed them quite generously, but again, it's just what they would eat in a few minutes, just a few little bits frozen, put in a few minutes apart. But as I say, it's quite hard to overdo Cyclops. And once again, I like to sort of observe the fish and just kind of see what's going on while I'm doing that. And then later in the day, normally around about 9:30 in the evening, which is about half an hour before the lights go out, my fish would basically have the last feed of the day. And like most things, I like to keep the best for last, as it were, mainly because at this time of the day is when I'm most likely to be around and have time to actually really sit and watch for the longest. So it's something that I really like to do and really enjoy doing. And I always carefully feed my tanks, and I really like to enjoy and watch them, as I say. And out of all the foods that I use, this is one that I always kind of think of as, I think of it as almost like a superfood, really. And that's black mosquito larvae. And not only do the fish absolutely love this, probably more than anything, certainly anything that I use anyway, it's absolutely fantastic for getting fish into spawning condition. And I'm sure it's one of the reasons that my fish spawn continually, especially the globalites and the lemon tetras. They're basically unstoppable. They spawn every single morning. And I actually had a friend who was a commercial fish breeder for many, many years, and he swore by black mosquito larvae as it gave me vastly superior yields, way less fertile eggs. And unlike some foods like bloodworm, which fish absolutely love, as I say, it keeps the fertility of fish. Things like bloodworm seem to make your fish very fat, and they often actually seem to lose fertility. And I'm sure it's different for different species, but certainly for the kind of small fish, sort of primarily tetras and things that I keep, this definitely seems to be the case and has always worked very well. And a little bit like Cyclops, it seems to be one of those foods that's vastly overlooked, which I think is a real shame apart from anything else, because watching your fish spawn every morning is just one of the wonders of owning an aquarium. And I think anything that makes a tank more interesting is definitely a sort of positive thing, really. And even if you don't actually get any babies to survive, it's really just a fun thing, as I say. Again, I feed this quite generously, but again, I make sure nothing goes to waste. But considering how many fish I have in this tank, it really isn't that much. It's just enough, really, to each fish maybe get a little piece each, as it were. You'll find that the pick of frozen foods that I use are the ones that I feel actually replicate the sort of most likely diets of the kind of small fish that I'm keeping. So Cyclops, black mosquito larvae and Daphne are kind of fit that bill really, really well. However, I never actually use bloodworm or tubifex. I've never been a fan of either of those. I know fish love it, but I'm not convinced they're particularly good for your fish. Likewise, I tend to use more natural foods rather than dry foods, even if they are frozen foods. I tend to think that the softer foods are better for your fish, and obviously that little bit more natural. And in summer, I'll also substitute these frozen foods for stuff that I collect from my ponds and water butts, which is basically the same kind of thing: Daphnia, Cyclops, glassworm, mosquito larvae, etc. And I'm sure lots of things that are unidentified that I'm not really sure what they are, but the fish love them all anyway. And you also notice that all both the live and the freshwater foods that I use, frozen foods rather, I use, are actually all fresh water. I've always felt that it's rather unnatural to use foods that are actually of marine origin, things like brine shrimp and mysis. So I've always avoided those because freshwater fish would basically never encounter these, so it just doesn't seem right to me. And obviously, apart from all the food that I'm actually giving the fish in this tank, the fish also sort of supplement their diet with lots of natural foods, because this tank, as some of you will know, has something of a little sort of mini food web going on in it. And some of you may have seen my 28-year-old substrate secrets video, which goes into that in a little bit more detail. So I'll put a link in the comments if anyone's interested in that. But one of the reasons that I like to add lots of diversity to the tank is all these extra little bits of food the fish get. I find that the fish love to sort of pick at snail eggs and even baby snails, There's lots of little tiny crustaceans in the tank, some of which I think are actually probably cyclops anyway. They just managed to hide amongst this enormous thicket of moss and cryptocoryons on the bottom. And as some of you know, have watched that video, that there's also tube effects in the substrate which they can pick at from time to time. And a lot of fish also like to eat little bits of decaying vegetation, and some fish like the lemon tetras actually even seem to enjoy a little bit of fresh material, which can be a little bit annoying sometimes, but they don't really pull the plants about enough to particularly worry about, so I don't mind. They're only doing what comes naturally at the end of the day. I choose actually deliberately not to add leaf litter to this tank. I work on the theory that a tank of this sort of level of maturity already has plenty of aquatic plants actually decaying away naturally in it. So if the fish and the organisms in it need that level of decay for food, it's basically already there in this tank. It's just being cycled in a slightly different way, in that I'm adding fish food rather than leaves to actually fuel that sort of cycle of life, as it were. But the end result seems to be pretty similar, and it's always been very successful for me anyway. In any case, I've always found that if you have an excessive amount of sort of vegetable material decaying in a tank, you're always much more likely to get algae. So I much prefer to keep it sort of fairly minimal and just be the natural decay that actually goes on within the tank. For this reason, I tend to prefer to feed my fish a little bit more directly, basically by using fish foods, as I say, 3 times a day. But at the end of the day, I think one of the greatest joys of owning an aquarium is actually feeding your fish and just being able to sit back and actually watch and enjoy your fish. And I know I've said this many times, but it is one of the greatest things about owning an aquarium. And feeding your fish is just the absolute perfect time to observe things and really just to see what's going on. But not only that, it's a really good time to look out or spot any sort of potential problems. You're able to actually observe the sort of hierarchy that goes on within your tank at feeding times. It's easy to spot if a fish is kind of bullying other fish and pinching all the food at other fish's sort of expense, as it were. Or perhaps you've got a sick fish, or, well, quite often when you're feeding fish, you'll find you have an odd fish which stays out of the feeding frenzy and sits in a corner. And these are all little warning signs that you wouldn't really pick up on unless you're actually just sitting in front of your tank, chilling out, feeding your fish. It's a great thing, and it's a really useful thing to do. And sometimes the things that you spot are literally nothing more than just too much competition in a tank. And especially if you've got very mixed tanks, you'll find that any sort of slow fish can have a little bit of a job keeping up and getting sufficient food. So it just enables you to sort of spot and pinpoint these things. And this is pretty much why I've always gone for the little and often sort of strategy when it comes to feeding fish. I've always found this gives me far less fish problems, and if there are problems, as I say, I can actually observe them. And I find if you're not feeding things little and often, it's very easy for the weaker fish to simply get weaker. If you're only feeding your fish sort of once a day or once every couple of days, if one of the weaker fish actually misses a meal, they basically have to wait too long for their next chance, and they just get kind of weaker and weaker. And whilst I'm acutely aware that overfeeding is a big issue, I would put a real emphasis on little and often is the way that I've always fed my fish, and the way that I would personally always recommend. And even if this actually means you're actually feeding exactly the same amount of food, it's just simply spread across more meals, and it's just a more smooth way of doing it, is how I kind of look at it. And I actually used to explain this a lot to customers in my shop, and it's one of those things I used to say to people, well, think of it yourself, instead of having 3 meals a day, try having just one huge meal every 2 or 3 days, and then just see how you feel after a few days or a few weeks of doing that. And I've always found that really kind of makes people think. And while I know it isn't exactly comparable because of the natural sort of food web and other little bits of food your fish get in an aquaria, I think it's one of those useful things to always consider, even if it's just, in the back of your mind, as it were. And certainly, food webs are things to definitely bear in mind, and, they do help things along. But I think for the vast majority of tanks, they are just a help. They're not the sort of main source of food for certainly a lot of tanks anyway. And certainly what I've always found with my tanks is that consistency is important, and actually on really an awful lot of different levels. Not only does consistently feeding the tank actually provide a constant steady flow of nutrients for your plants, but probably most importantly of all, it doesn't overload the filter. You'll find that filters and all the microorganisms and everything, they really work best and are most effective with just a slow sort of steady workload. They really don't function very well on a kind of boom and bust sort of scenario. Everything is best really just ticking along and just being, as I say, as consistent as possible. And I've always felt that this level of stability and consistency is very much the key to success, and certainly helps you along. So very much little and often. And I've always felt that overfeeding actually has very little to do with how often you feed fish. It's much more about quantity, because basically too much is always too much. It's really just watching the amount that you put in, but you can do lots and lots of little meals quite happily. I remember that most of these small fish, certainly the kind of fish that I'm keeping anyway, in nature they would eat pretty much almost constantly, just tiny amounts all the way through the day. Well, again, creating a food web helps this enormously. For the vast majority of fish keeping, or fish keepers rather, feeding little and often is definitely what I would recommend, and it's certainly what I've always done anyway. And I should just say that this is my personal preference, and it's not necessarily right for everyone, but it's basically what I've done for the entire 28 years of this tank's existence. And to this day, this tank continues to do well with no water changes, and yet it still tests out amazingly well with zero measurable nitrate and phosphate and a really steady sort of TDS level. So I'm really happy with the way it is, so that's definitely the way I will continue to run things. Anyway, lastly today, just a quick little update really for my regular viewers. I decided actually to go with the 340-gallon tanks and not the 425-gallon tanks for my sort of upcoming project, as it were. As strange as it might sound, aesthetically I found I just couldn't live with an even number of tanks. I just don't think it would look right of having a row of 4 tanks. Just I don't know, it just didn't look right to me. So a row of 3 tanks I think is much nicer for the new tanks. And actually, as you can see here, 2 of them are actually already up on their cabinets and ready to go, as it were. But unfortunately, I'm not sure when I'm actually going to have the time to start on them yet. It's basically spring here, so I'm frantically trying to plant up a big new area of my new Mediterranean garden. So that's taking up an awful lot of my time at the moment. But maybe we'll get some sort of wet, rainy days, and I might be able to make a bit of a start. But I want to try a few new ideas on these tanks. So I know some of them will be incredibly time consuming to actually complete. So I'll tell you about them once I've actually started and they're actually underway. But at least some of the tanks are here, so a little bit of progress has been made anyway. So if you'd like to know more about my naturally balanced, no water changed, unfertilised aquariums, I'd be eternally grateful if you'd subscribe and give me a like. And if you'd like to support this channel and help it reach more people, please share as well. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.